I've been in the conservative movement really since I was a teenager. I'd say 50 years or so. Fighting for Ronald Reagan's election against the Republican establishment and fighting them every step of the way in the Tea Party. You have to recall these same institutions, while taking advantage of the Tea Party, would trash the Tea Party. While they wanted the votes of the Tea Party, they never seriously embraced the Tea Party. Every serious movement aimed at advancing the cause of liberty, serious efforts to get our government back, serious efforts to institute the Constitution as written has been fought, not just by the media and the left, but by the Republican establishment. That's exactly what's happening today. I have read every statement I can get my hands on from a Republican senator, or in some cases groups of senators, who've disavowed any effort to seriously review the constitutionality of some of these electors from some of these states. And that's the issue. I have watched very carefully news programs, including news programs on my favorite cable channel. I've watched how they've talked about this effort, and they too have somehow avoided discussing the Constitution with respect to what went on in some of these states. And they're doing this for a reason, and I'll explain that as we go along. Now, first things first. 4 battleground states I pick. If you've listened to me on radio, watched me on Fox, been reading anything I've been writing, let me just underscore the point. For those of you who are new to this, let me make the point. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia. Those 4 battleground states were targeted by the Democrat Party, left-wing groups, and others, the Biden campaign, to do what? Well, you can't win the presidency without those 4 battleground states. The problem for the Democrats and the left is that every one of those battleground states has Republican legislatures. Now, under our Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, it's the legislatures that direct, the word direct, how electors are to be chosen. In other words, it's the legislatures that make election laws. That's in the body of the Constitution. That's not in some amendment. That's not an afterthought. The ratifiers of the Constitution in the states would never have ratified the Constitution without that specific reference to the state legislatures writing the law. They wanted to protect what was theirs, the sovereignty of the electoral process, and they wanted it to be in the hands of the state legislatures. Why? Well, going back to the Constitutional Convention, there was a lot of debate on how to select a president, on what a president would look like. There was some discussion that maybe he should come out of Congress. They nixed that. Some discussion maybe there should be a judicial council involved in the selection. They nixed that. Some discussion about a direct vote. They nixed that. And they came up with this genius electoral college system. And at the beginning of that process, they wanted to make sure the state legislatures had monopoly control over it. Why? Because although they opposed the direct election of president and vice president, they wanted the body closest to the people to be involved in determining how electors would be chosen in those states. Nobody talked about governors or secretaries of state, and certainly not courts, state or federal. Federal courts hadn't even been created at that point. They would never have agreed to that, and none of them did. State legislatures. So if you're going to have an election for a president and vice president, you got to look at the beginning of the process. And the Constitution tells us the state legislatures, not the state legislatures must direct how those elections will occur and how these electors will be chosen. So for the Democrat Party, the Biden campaign, and their left-wing surrogates, they had to get around this. And they did. In Pennsylvania, it was the most loathsome example of what they did. They had an effort with the Democrat governor, the Democrat Secretary of State, and the majority Democrat and elected Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. What did they do? They couldn't get the changes they wanted through the Republican legislature, so they went to the Democrat Supreme Court, and they got every single change they wanted, despite objections from the state legislature. Elimination elimination of signatures, elimination of signature comparisons, elimination of the postal stamp, elimination of the actual election deadline that was firm under Pennsylvania law, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday. It was moved to 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday. And Republican observers, and I go on and on. Other changes were made by the Secretary of State during the course of the election and right after the election on how to count ballots. The state legislature had no role whatsoever, none. In the state of Michigan, a number of election changes were made by the Democrat Secretary of State, again, without the support, in fact, with the opposition of the Republican state legislature, including, and this is the big one, under Michigan law, if you want to vote by absentee ballot, you must make a request, and that request must be accompanied by some kind of significant identification. Secretary of State said, no. I'm sending out 7 million unsolicited ballots to our election rolls. And that's what she did, in clear violation of Michigan law. What about Wisconsin? Much of the same occurred in Wisconsin, but even worse. You had the 5 biggest Democrat cities in Wisconsin, leading Milwaukee and Madison, that decided to change the election laws. Among other things, they decided to put out these drop boxes all throughout their cities, unmanned, for days at a time. But under Wisconsin law, you cannot have unmanned drop boxes. In every respect, a person must be there, an official must be there, to determine if the ballot that is cast, whether it's dropped off or not, is cast in a lawful manner. That did not happen. Moreover, these drop boxes were put in strategically beneficial areas for Democrats and not so much in Republican areas. They also were actually giving advice to voters on how to avoid the strict ID requirements and other security measures that were in state law. And then in Georgia, you have Republicans controlling the legislature and Republicans controlling the governorship, lieutenant governorship, and in this case also the Secretary of State, who's a true reprobate. They're sued. The state is sued, the Secretary of State is sued by an organization, a front group for Stacey Abrams, as you know, is a left-wing radical. And so the Secretary of State consents in a consent decree to weaken, basically obliterate the signature requirement. Now, what do I mean by that? You have to have 3 registrars agree if a signature is to be thrown out or not. And you have this in a number of states that took place, Nevada and so forth. So this is why you saw the number of so-called poison ballots or sour ballots. Even though you had massive new mail-in voting and absentee voting because of the change in laws, mostly not by legislatures, but some legislatures, such an insignificant number of ballots that were tossed out because they made it nearly impossible to toss out any ballots. You can see why the President of the United States is furious. Apart from all the fraud, I am focused exclusively on the Constitution. And this is exactly what these Republicans in the Senate do not want to discuss. Which brings me to my point. The elections in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and Georgia violated Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution. Of this, there's no question. A fairly conservative senator called me on the phone the other day, and he said, but Congress can't have de novo review, in other words, plenary review, hold trials, hold hearings on whether or not state law is adequate or not. I said, no. You're arguing in the alternative. I've got the facts. We know this took place. This is not in dispute. This isn't an issue of fraud. It's not an issue of factual dispute. It's not an issue of evidence. It took place. And everybody knows it took place because people voted under these new changes, right? And notice only the Democrats pushed this stuff. They pushed this stuff because they wanted to institutionalize fraud. They wanted to institutionalize a process by which they would win, which is exactly what they did. So, 4 states where the electoral process which was followed was not the electoral process in many respects that was set forth in the United States Constitution. And so the Democrats wind up choosing the electors. the Democrat governors, and in the case of some of these other states, even Republican governors like Georgia. And they send them off ministerially to the Archivist of the United States, who collects them all. And then on January 6th, they're all provided to this joint session of Congress that meets, where the Vice President of the United States sits as the president or the manager of the process. Now, brings me to the next point. The 12th Amendment says that Congress shall count the votes. Shall count the votes. I heard one conservative congressman from California in a radio interview with one of my friends saying, it says shall, we have no alternative. It doesn't matter how these electors came to us, we have to count them. I want you to think about that irrationality for a second. So when the framers of the Constitution wrote that the state legislatures exclusively determine election law, they meant that even if that provision of the Constitution is violated, when they later amended it with the 12th Amendment, that the Congress must count unconstitutional electors? Now think about how absurd that is. No. The framers assumed, and those who wrote and adopted and ratified the 12th Amendment to the Constitution assumed, that the process would be followed as laid out in the Constitution. They didn't say forget about what takes place in the states and just count the electors. Otherwise, why even give the process to Congress? Give it to some homeless guy down the street, as long as he has a calculator or she has and they can add it up and say, all right, there's the winner.
For more, sign up for Levin TV.